You grew up believing that your needs were a burden. You remember it, even if you've never said it out loud, the subtle shift in the room whenever you asked for something. The way your parents' faces hardened, the sighs, the silence, or the carefully chosen words that told you, without saying it directly, your feelings are too much. Over time, you stopped asking. You stopped showing. You learned to bury your needs, your anger, your joy, anything that made you take up space. And so, you became the child who was good at listening, the child who didn't argue, the child who smiled when they were breaking inside, the one who was praised for being mature for their age, but only because they had been forced to abandon the natural selfishness every child is entitled to. Carl Jung understood this hidden wound. He believed that the empath, the person who feels deeply, who sacrifices, who bends themselves into silence, is not simply born that way. They are shaped by an environment that tells them again and again that their own self is unacceptable. What looks like empathy is often survival. To grow up like this is to grow up chained to an invisible rule: do not disturb, do not demand, do not be too much. You may not remember the moment you learned it, but it etched itself into your nervous system. When a child's individuality is dismissed, they adapt, and one of the most common adaptations is to become endlessly attentive to the needs of others. It feels safe to give, it feels dangerous to take. Jung called this a kind of psychic mutilation, a distortion of the self. The child learns that their worth comes not from being who they are, but from being who others need them to be. On the outside, this looks admirable. The empath is kind. The empath is selfless. The empath is the one everyone turns to in crisis. But on the inside, there is a silent wound, the belief that I only matter if I erase myself. Think about how exhausting that is. To be a child and already believe that your desires are dangerous, to silence your own voice before it even leaves your mouth, to watch yourself shrink just to keep peace in the room. And what's worse is that the world rewards it. Teachers call you responsible. Family members say you're the easy one. Friends admire how much you give. You grow up praised for the very thing that keeps you disconnected from yourself. Jung warned that what society calls goodness often hides a deeper violence, the violence we do to our own soul when we silence its cries. This is the empath's silent wound, not that they feel too much, but that they were never allowed to feel enough for themselves. It creates a kind of emptiness, a quiet ache. You might notice it when you're alone, when no one is asking anything of you. Instead of peace, you feel restless. Instead of comfort, you feel hollow, because somewhere deep down you know that you've built your life on a single unspoken rule: everyone else comes first. And yet that rule is killing you. The empath is not fragile. The empath is not weak. The empath is simply carrying the weight of a childhood where love was conditional, where love was tied to silence, where being good meant disappearing. But here's the truth Jung left us with. What has been repressed never disappears. It waits. The child you once were, the one who wanted to be selfish, loud, demanding, alive, is still inside you, still knocking, still begging to be seen. And this is where the story begins. Because the silent wound is not just a tragedy, it is also a signal, a reminder that what you lost can be reclaimed. That empathy does not have to mean erasure, that yourself, the one you buried so long ago, has not been destroyed, only silenced. In this first step of the journey, the empath begins to see their past for what it was, not a testament of strength, but a history of survival. You were never born to be endlessly selfless. You were forced into it. You adapted to an environment that told you selfishness was dangerous. But adaptation is not destiny. The child who was never allowed to be selfish can grow into the adult who finally chooses themselves. Not every act of kindness is pure. Sometimes, goodness is just fear wearing a mask. Carl Jung warned us that what society praises as goodness often hides a dangerous illusion. We admire the person who gives endlessly, who sacrifices without complaint, who bends themselves in every direction for the sake of others. But Jung saw through the surface. He understood that much of what we call good is not genuine virtue. It is repression disguised as morality. The empath knows this truth better than anyone. From the outside, their life looks noble, always available, always understanding, always forgiving. But underneath that mask is something darker, the belief that if they stop giving, they will no longer be loved. This is not kindness, this is survival. When a child is denied the right to be selfish, they develop what Jung called a false persona. This persona becomes their shield, the good version of themselves that hides the parts they fear will be rejected. They smile while they're hurting, they say yes while they're screaming no, they give when they have nothing left to give. And society rewards this mask. The empath is praised for being selfless. They are seen as morally superior, as if their endless sacrifice is proof of strength. But Jung reminds us, what appears virtuous on the outside can be a form of self-betrayal on the inside. Because goodness born from fear is not goodness, it is bondage. Think about the cost of living this way. Every time you suppress your anger, you fracture your authenticity. Every time you force yourself to be calm when you're hurting, you bury your truth deeper into the unconscious. Over time, this creates a split inside you. On one side, the mask, polite, kind, endlessly accommodating. On the other, the repressed self, angry, tired, desperate to exist. Jung believed that when this split goes on too long, the shadow grows. And the shadow does not disappear just because you hide it. It waits, it festers, and eventually it erupts. This is why the empath often experiences sudden breakdowns, explosive anger, or moments of complete withdrawal. The mask can only hold for so long before the shadow demands to be seen. Jung warned that ignoring the shadow is one of the most dangerous things a person can do, because what we refuse to face in ourselves eventually controls us from the dark. False goodness, then, is not only exhausting, it is dangerous. And yet, the empath struggles to let it go. Why? Because the mask works. It keeps the peace. It wins approval. It protects relationships. For years, it may even seem like the only way to survive. But survival has a cost. Living in constant sacrifice may keep others happy, but it keeps you disconnected from your own soul. You begin to wonder who you really are beneath the mask. You might even fear that without your goodness, you are nothing. This is the silent tragedy Jung tried to illuminate, that a life built on false goodness is not a life truly lived. It is a performance, and no performance can replace authenticity. The realization is painful, but necessary. Some of your most admired traits, your empathy, your giving nature, your constant availability, may not come from genuine choice. They may come from fear. Fear of rejection, fear of conflict, fear of being unloved. And here lies Jung's warning. If your kindness is built on fear, it is not kindness, it is self-erasure. The true task, Jung believed, is to break free from the mask, to let yourself be selfish, to allow the shadow, the repressed anger, the hidden desires, the lost voice to come into the light. Only then can empathy transform from a survival mechanism into a genuine gift. Because real empathy, the kind that heals, does not come from fear, it comes from wholeness. So the empath must ask themselves a terrifying question. Am I good because I choose to be, or because I am afraid not to be? The answer to that question is the beginning of individuation, the process of becoming your true self.
Imagine spending years building a house, only to discover its foundation was never real. One day, without warning, the walls begin to crack. That is what happens when the empath's illusion collapses. For so long, the empath's identity rests on a fragile structure. If I keep giving, if I keep forgiving, if I keep sacrificing, I will be loved. I will be safe. It feels unshakable, like a law of existence, but Jung understood that illusions, no matter how strong, are destined to fall when reality intrudes. The collapse often begins quietly, a single betrayal, a friend who takes too much, a partner who mistakes kindness for weakness. At first, the empath explains it away. Maybe I didn't give enough. Maybe I should have tried harder. But over time, the cracks widen. No matter how much they give, the emptiness grows. And then comes the moment no empath forgets. The realization that their sacrifice was never enough to guarantee love. The illusion shatters. This collapse is devastating. Everything the empath believed about themselves, that goodness secures belonging, that silence preserves harmony, that self-denial is noble, suddenly feels false. It's as if the ground disappears beneath them. Jung described this moment as a confrontation with the shadow. The parts of the self long suppressed, anger, desire, boundaries, surge to the surface. It's overwhelming, even terrifying, because the empath has spent their life believing those parts were bad. But in truth, this eruption is not destruction, it is revelation. The collapse of illusions is painful precisely because it exposes how much of life was built on fear. It forces the empath to face questions they avoided for years. Who am I if I stop being what others need? What if my real self is not lovable? Have I betrayed myself in the name of being good? These are not gentle questions. They cut deep. They shake identity to the core. But Jung believed that only by enduring this collapse can a person begin to live authentically. The empath often resists this shift. They cling to the old illusion because it feels safer. They may double down on giving, hoping to restore balance, but the truth cannot be unseen. Once the mask cracks, it will never fit the same way again. The breakdown becomes unavoidable. The friendships they once tolerated now feel suffocating. The relationships they once endured now feel exploitative. The life they carefully performed now feels like a cage. And with that awareness comes grief. Grief for the years lost to self-denial. Grief for the love they never received in return. Grief for the person they might have been if they had been free to be selfish as a child. This grief is not weakness. It is a doorway. The collapse of illusions, though agonizing, is also the beginning of transformation, because when the old structures fall, the possibility of something new finally emerges. Jung often compared this process to alchemy. The breakdown is like the burning stage where old matter is dissolved. It feels like destruction, but it is actually preparation. The false self must dissolve so that the true self can be reborn. This is why the empath's collapse is not the end of their story, it is the turning point. And yet, in the midst of it, the empath often feels lost. They may question their sanity. They may isolate themselves, unable to explain why life feels suddenly unbearable. They may even wish they could go back to the illusion, to the comforting lie that giving endlessly would keep them safe. But there is no return. Once you see the illusion for what it is, it loses its power. The only path is forward, through the grief, through the fear, into the unknown territory of authenticity. Jung's message here is both sobering and liberating. Illusions collapse not to punish us, but to free us. The pain you feel in these moments is not a sign of failure. It is the first breath of truth. The empath, in losing their illusion, is not losing themselves. They are, for the first time, beginning to find themselves. When the empath breaks, it doesn't look like rage. It looks like silence, and that silence is more powerful than any scream. For years, the empath has lived in quiet sacrifice. They gave, forgave, endured. They absorbed the weight of others, believing it was their duty. Even as illusions cracked, they held on, hoping something might change. But there comes a moment, small to the outside world, seismic within, when something inside finally says, "No more." This breaking point is not a loud explosion, but a silent withdrawal. The empath who once said yes out of fear begins to say no out of truth. They stop chasing, they stop explaining, they stop contorting themselves to fit roles that were never theirs to carry. To outsiders, this silence might seem cold, but to the empath, it is liberation. It is the first time they taste the power of boundaries, not as walls to shut people out, but as shields to protect the self they almost lost. Psychologically, this breaking point reflects Jung's idea of individuation, the process of becoming whole. For the empath, silence becomes the language of self-respect. It is not about punishing others. It is about reclaiming space that was always theirs. This silence unsettles those who once fed on their compliance. The narcissist in particular is caught off guard. They built their power on the empath's willingness to submit, but when that submission ends, their control unravels. The empath's quiet refusal is something the narcissist cannot manipulate because it does not seek approval. The empath often underestimates the force of this moment. They imagine they are simply withdrawing, but in reality, they are unleashing a transformation. By refusing to play the old role, they expose the imbalance of every relationship built on their silence. This is why the breaking point feels unstoppable. Once the empath has tasted freedom, they cannot return to the prison of people-pleasing. Even if they try, the old patterns feel unbearable. The body rebels, the psyche refuses. What once felt normal now feels like betrayal. For the empath, this shift is both exhilarating and terrifying. Exhilarating because they finally feel alive in their own skin. Terrifying because the people around them may resist, protest, or abandon them. Silence, though powerful, can also feel lonely. But Jung's insight is clear. True growth often begins in solitude. The empath must endure the discomfort of standing apart to discover the strength of standing within. At this stage, the empath often encounters doubt. They may ask themselves, "Am I being selfish? What if no one loves the real me? What if my silence destroys everything I've built?" These fears are natural. They are echoes of the old illusion. But with each boundary held, with each silence maintained, the empath learns that respect is not won through sacrifice. It is cultivated through authenticity. The breaking point is not the end of relationships, though some will end. It is the end of submission. The empath learns that love given freely, not coerced, is the only love worth keeping. And in this realization, something extraordinary happens. The empath's silence, once a mark of fear, becomes a symbol of power. It is no longer the silence of suppression. It is the silence of choice. This is why Jung's message resonates so deeply here. The empath's breaking point is not destruction. It is rebirth. The world may not notice it immediately. The narcissist may not understand it at all. But within the empath, the shift is irreversible. The person who once lived only for others is gone. In their place stands someone who can finally live for themselves.
You don't owe anyone an explanation for protecting your own peace. One of the most difficult lessons for the empath is learning to say a simple word, no. For years, their identity revolved around pleasing, accommodating, and avoiding conflict. To them, no felt like rejection, like cruelty, like a betrayal of the very essence of who they believed themselves to be. But here is the truth. Every time the empath said yes, when their heart was screaming no, they betrayed themselves. That quiet betrayal accumulated until it became unbearable, leading to the breaking point. And from that breaking point emerges the first, hesitant but powerful boundary. Saying no without explanation is not about arrogance. It is not about closing the door on love or kindness. It is about refusing to justify one's existence. Think about it. Why does the empath feel the need to explain themselves every time they set a boundary? It is because they were conditioned to believe that their needs were less important, that they had to earn the right to exist comfortably. But true selfhood does not require justification. As Jung suggested, individuation means stepping out of roles imposed by others, and part of that process is realizing that your choices are valid, even if no one else understands them. The empath's no often shocks those around them. The narcissist, who once thrived on compliance, suddenly finds the game changed. No longer can they guilt, manipulate, or pressure their way into control. The empath's refusal, stated calmly and without explanation, becomes a wall they cannot climb. And this creates a new dynamic. Power begins to shift. For the first time, the empath is not reacting to others, but acting from within. Their decisions are no longer based on fear of rejection, but on alignment with truth. This is not easy. The first no may leave the empath trembling. They may feel guilt, shame, even fear. But over time, they discover something remarkable. The world does not end when they refuse. Those who truly care will adjust. Those who don't will reveal their true colors. This is the hidden power of boundaries. They don't just protect you, they reveal who belongs in your life. The people who remain will be those who value you for who you are, not for what you provide. Psychologically, this is a form of shadow integration. For the empath, the shadow often contains suppressed anger, repressed desires, and denied needs. Saying no is the first step towards bringing that shadow into the light. It acknowledges that the self is not only giving and forgiving, it is also protective, discerning, and worthy of respect. And here lies the paradox. By saying no to others, the empath finally says yes to themselves. For the first time, their energy is directed inward, not in selfishness, but in self-preservation. They realize that without honoring their own limits, their capacity to love is not pure. It is poisoned by resentment. No becomes the filter through which authenticity is born. It removes the noise, the distractions, the people who drain. And in the quiet that follows, the empath discovers space to grow into who they were always meant to be. This realization is profoundly liberating. The empath learns that boundaries are not barriers against connection, they are the foundation for real connection. Because only when you are free to say no does your yes carry meaning. And as this practice strengthens, the empath notices something extraordinary. Life begins to align, relationships feel lighter, choices feel clearer, and the exhaustion that once consumed them slowly fades. The narcissist, of course, cannot understand this power. To them, boundaries feel like rejection, but to the empath, boundaries feel like oxygen. And though the narcissist may rage, protest, or attempt to manipulate, they no longer hold the same sway. The empath has tasted freedom, and no guilt trap can take it away. By this stage, the empath begins to recognize that self-respect is not earned by endless sacrifice. It is cultivated by honoring one's truth, without apology. And in that truth, they discover the strength Jung pointed toward all along. The courage to individuate, to stand as a whole person, not half of one. The narcissist never prepares for the day their control stops working. For years, the narcissist has depended on a predictable pattern. They push, and the empath bends. They guilt, and the empath forgives. They demand, and the empath provides. To the narcissist, this cycle feels permanent, almost natural. That's why the empath's shift comes as such a shock. When silence turns into strength, and when yes finally transforms into no, the narcissist is blindsided. It is not because they didn't see the empath suffering, it's because they never believed the empath had the courage to leave the role assigned to them. This blindness is built into the narcissist's psychology. Their worldview is self-centered, distorted by entitlement, and fueled by fragile self-esteem. To them, people exist to serve their needs, not to hold boundaries.
They cannot imagine the empath as an independent force, because doing so would shatter their illusion of superiority. And so when the empath finally changes the script, the narcissist scrambles. Their manipulation tactics, once effective, suddenly bounce back with no effect. The guilt trips sound hollow, the anger feels desperate, the charm looks false. For the narcissist, this is not just rejection, it is an existential crisis. Psychologically, this moment exposes the narcissist's core wound, the terror of being insignificant. Their entire identity is built on extracting attention, admiration, and control. When the empath detaches, it threatens the foundation of their self-concept. But here's the paradox. While the empath is finding liberation, the narcissist is drowning in confusion. They can't see it coming because they were never truly looking at the empath to begin with. They were only ever looking at their reflection in the empath. Imagine standing in front of a mirror for years, believing it would always reflect you back. And then one day, the mirror no longer shows your face. Instead, it turns into a window. That is what the empath becomes, a clear view into reality, and the narcissist is horrified. For the empath, witnessing this shift is powerful. They realize that their silence and boundaries are not just personal healing, they are kryptonite to narcissistic control. And in this recognition comes another wave of strength, the understanding that the narcissist was never truly powerful. The power always belonged to the empath, but it was hidden beneath layers of guilt and fear. Carl Jung often spoke of the unconscious patterns that drive our behavior. The narcissist is enslaved by their shadow, blind to their own wounds. They cannot see the shift because it requires self-awareness, something they avoid at all costs. Meanwhile, the empath is integrating their shadow, embracing both their vulnerability and their strength. The contrast is staggering. One sinks deeper into denial, while the other rises into authenticity. This stage is not about revenge. The empath does not delight in the narcissist's downfall. Instead, it becomes a profound lesson. People who refuse to face themselves will always be blindsided by those who finally do. And as the empath steps further into selfhood, they begin to understand that the narcissist's blindness was never personal. It was a reflection of their own limits, their inability to love without control. Emotionally, this realization is both sobering and freeing. The empath no longer takes the narcissist's behavior as proof of their worthlessness. They see it for what it is, a wound the narcissist cannot confront, and in that clarity, the empath finally releases the need for validation.
By now, the empath's journey has moved from pain to power, from silence to strength. The narcissist may rage, manipulate, or retreat, but it no longer matters. The blind spot is permanent. The shift cannot be unseen. And in this quiet victory, the empath discovers something essential. Freedom was never about changing the narcissist. It was about stepping outside of their control into the wide, open space of selfhood. Carl Jung believed that most people never truly meet themselves. They spend their whole lives wearing masks, avoiding the very parts of their soul that hold their freedom. The empath's journey through neglect, manipulation, and eventual awakening leads to something far deeper than just escape. It leads to individuation. This is the psychological process Jung described as becoming whole, integrating every fragmented piece of the self. For the empath, individuation begins the moment they stop existing only for others. When they dare to feel anger instead of repressing it. When they say no without guilt. When they recognize that their needs are just as real as anyone else's. That is the birth of the authentic self. But individuation is not about perfection, it's about integration. The empath once denied their selfishness, their anger, their desire for autonomy, because they were taught those parts were bad. Jung called these denied aspects the shadow. To become whole, the empath must face the shadow and welcome it back. This is terrifying at first.
To say, I can be kind and I can also be selfish. I can be gentle and I can also be strong. I am not just one thing, I am many things. It is in this paradox that individuation takes root. Psychologically, the empath begins to shift their identity. They stop identifying as just the giver, the healer, or the selfless one. Instead, they embrace the complexity of being human. They learn that boundaries are not cruelty, but clarity. That saying no is not abandonment, but self-respect. That selfishness, when balanced, is not evil, it is survival. Imagine a tree that has been pruned and cut back for years, shaped into something small and manageable. Then one day, the pruning stops. The tree begins to grow wildly, naturally, stretching in every direction. That is what individuation feels like for the empath. For the first time, growth is not restricted by someone else's control. Carl Jung insisted that individuation requires facing discomfort. The empath cannot heal by avoiding their wounds, they must confront them. They must admit to themselves, I was silenced, I was used, I was unseen. And then they must also admit, I allowed it because I was afraid of being alone or being selfish. This honesty is painful, but it is also liberating. By claiming both their suffering and their complicity, the empath finally steps out of victimhood and into agency. The emotional function of this stage is powerful. The empath no longer sees themselves as broken, they see themselves as layered. Every scar is not proof of weakness, it is proof of survival. Every shadow part is not an enemy, it is a source of hidden strength. Jung wrote, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. For the empath, individuation is exactly this, turning toward the darkness inside and finding wisdom there. This process changes how they move through life. Relationships no longer define their worth. Approval is no longer their currency. They don't live for validation, but for authenticity. Their self is no longer a performance, it is a reality. But individuation is not a final destination, it is a continuous unfolding. The empath realizes that every stage of life will present new shadows, new challenges, new opportunities for integration. And instead of fearing this, they embrace it, because now they understand the truth. Wholeness is not about being flawless, it's about being real. At this point, the empath's transformation begins to ripple outward. They become harder to manipulate, harder to guilt, harder to control. Their presence itself carries a weight, a sense of quiet power. People notice it, even if they can't name it. This is the mark of individuation, authenticity without apology. For the viewer, this stage resonates deeply. It reframes the empath's past suffering not as wasted years, but as necessary preparation. Every broken boundary, every painful silence, every collapse of identity was fuel for individuation. Without the wound, the healing would never have begun. By now, the empath's journey is not simply surviving, it is evolving. Their story is not one of loss, but of transformation. And as Jung warned, this is rare. Most people never get here because most people never dare to face themselves. The empath, through their suffering, has been forced into it, and in that, they find their final gift, the freedom to be whole. If you've seen yourself in this journey, if you felt invisible, used, or silenced, then this message is for you. The empath's path begins in silence. It begins in childhood, where love was conditional, where emotions were policed, where selfishness was forbidden. That silence followed them into adulthood, shaping their identity around other people's needs, leaving them vulnerable to manipulation, guilt, and control. But as we've seen, silence does not last forever. Pain builds, illusions collapse, and the empath awakens. The awakening is not a sudden explosion, it's a slow, quiet realization that grows louder with every step. I matter. My needs matter. My voice matters. At first, this realization feels selfish. It feels dangerous. It feels like betrayal. But in reality, it is freedom. Because to deny oneself forever is the greatest betrayal of all. Carl Jung's warning echoes here. The empath who awakens is no longer predictable, no longer easy to control. Their kindness no longer comes from fear. Their generosity no longer comes from guilt. They kind because they choose to, not because they must. They give because they want to, not because they're terrified of rejection. This shift is radical, and to those who once fed on the empath's silence, it is terrifying. But the empath doesn't awaken in hatred. They awaken in wholeness. They do not need revenge because their healing is their answer. They do not need validation because their authenticity is their strength. They no longer live to serve others at the cost of themselves. Imagine this moment, a mirror that once reflected only fragments, broken, distorted, incomplete, now reveals a full image, not perfect, but whole. Not flawless, but real. That is the empath after individuation. They are not just the healer, not just the giver. They are a human being with depth, anger, joy, boundaries, and love. They are not afraid of being selfish anymore because they've learned that selfishness is not the opposite of love. It is the foundation that makes love sustainable. Psychologically, this awakening is what Jung described as the reconciliation of opposites. The shadow and the light, the selfless and the selfish, the fragile and the strong, they are no longer at war inside the empath. They coexist, harmonize, and create something stronger: authenticity. For the viewer, this is the closing message. Your suffering has meaning. Your silence was not weakness, it was survival. Your breakdowns were not failures, they were awakenings. Your struggle with selfishness was not proof of being broken, it was the doorway to becoming whole. The empath's awakening is not just personal, it is archetypal. It represents what Jung saw as the ultimate human task: to become who you truly are, without apology, without illusion, without fear. This is why Jung's final message matters. The empath is just the child who was never allowed to be selfish. But that child does not stay silent forever. They grow, they break, they awaken, and eventually they become free.